Welcome, Zoomers, to your generation's Middle Eastern quagmire. America just bombed Iran.
Mr. Vice President, is the United States now at war with Iran?
No, Kristen, we're not at war with Iran. We're at war with Iran's nuclear program.
President Trump announced that U.S. warplanes obliterated Iran's nuclear sites. Are those sites really obliterated? We'll have to wait and see. What we do know is this: the president did not ask Congress for permission. He didn't even bother to consult with them. The White House said Trump acted under the legal authority afforded to him as commander-in-chief. But the Constitution also clearly gives Congress the power to declare war and control military funding. That leaves us with a big question. Under United States domestic law, can the president legally launch strikes like these without Congress? And what does it mean for the future of U.S. military engagement abroad? On June 22, 2025, the U.S. carried out Operation Midnight Hammer, launching precise airstrikes on 3 fortified Iranian nuclear facilities using B-2 stealth bombers with bunker buster bombs and Tomahawk missiles. The strikes were closely coordinated with Israel as part of a joint effort to neutralize Iran's nuclear capabilities. Israel took active steps to clear Iran's air defenses so that U.S. aircraft could fly safely and strike the sites. Israeli leaders, including Prime Minister Netanyahu, publicly endorsed the action and praised the joint operation, framing it as a defense against a shared threat. Trump officials emphasized that the attack aimed to pressure Iran back to diplomacy and to restore peace in the region. Don't worry, guys. According to Vice President Corporal Vance, we are not at war with Iran.
Big question. Is the United States now at war with Iran?
No, we're not at war with Iran, John. We're at war with Iran's nuclear program.
Plus, it's definitely not going to lead to anything more.
I certainly empathize with Americans who are exhausted after 25 years of foreign entanglements in the Middle East. I understand the concern, but the difference is that back then we had dumb presidents, and now we have a president who actually knows how to accomplish America's national security objectives.
The U.S. strike on Iran was not a casual, let's drop a few cruise missiles on the bad guys kind of mission. It was a highly complex joint operation with substantial commitment of military resources and personnel. It involved 125 aircraft, an Ohio-class nuclear submarine, and nearly the entire fleet of America's most important strategic bombers, all sent into harm's way. Critically, according to open source intelligence, the United States is the only country that actually has non-nuclear weaponry capable of blowing up Iran's nuclear enrichment facilities deep underground. Israel knows this, presumably, and thus has every incentive to persuade Trump to join the war. So early Friday morning, 14 of America's fleet of 20 B-2 stealth bombers left Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri and entered Iranian airspace undetected about 18 hours later. It was the second longest combat flight in the history of the airframe. And what they brought with them was the 30,000-pound GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, or MOP, or the bomb she told you not to worry about. According to the manufacturer Boeing, the MOP penetrates up to 200 feet of reinforced concrete and about 130 feet of hard rock. No other non-nuclear munition in the world, at least that we know of, can penetrate this deep. Again, she told you don't need to worry about it. But there are two big reasons why the Air Force has never dropped one in anger until last weekend, even though we've had them since 2015. First, while the exact expense figures are not publicly available, defense analysts confidently place the cost of R&D for the MOP bomb at around $400 million taxpayer dollars, and on top of that, anywhere from 3.5 to 20 million TDPB. That's tax dollars per boom. The exact quantity in our stockpile is not public information, but analysts place it around less than 200. So it's not the kind of thing you want to use every time a Taliban fighter hides in a cave. But enormous costs aside, this is a strategic weapon. You only get to move that chess piece once before everyone knows if it really does what it says on the tin, and how deep they need to build their future bunkers. Now, information about the aftermath of the bombing is still coming in, but according to at least one senior US official, as reported by the New York Times, the facility at the Fordo site was badly damaged but not destroyed. This changes the state of geopolitical play for better or for worse. If the mission did not achieve strategic success to Trump or Israel's satisfaction, he may be inclined to escalate further military action or engage in escalating tit-for-tat in response to Iran's counterstrikes. This is how executive military action can quickly lead to all-out war in everything but name and declaration from Congress.
Now, sorry to interrupt, but if you bomb a foreign country, you're going to want a good lawyer. But if you want a great lawyer, my law firm, the Eagle Team, can help. If you've got in a car crash, suffered a data breach, especially if you've got a data breach letter saying your information might have been leaked, or dealing with a workers' comp or social security issue, we can represent you or help find you the right attorney. And by the way, we don't get paid unless you do, so there's nothing up front. So just click on the link in the description or call the phone number on screen for a free consultation with my team. Because you don't just need a legal team, you need the Eagle Team.
So is the United States at war with Iran right now? Legally speaking, no. The United States is not at war with Iran. But the full answer is more complicated, and it depends on how you define war and which branch of government you ask. Under Article 1, Section 8, Congress has the authority to declare war, raise and support armies, provide and maintain a navy, make rules governing the military, call forth the militia, and regulate commerce with foreign nations, which includes war-related sanctions and trade embargoes. The bottom line is that the Constitution gives Congress the authority to decide whether to go to war, which includes declaring it, funding it, and initiating military actions. Several founding fathers believed this power was exclusive to Congress. Generally, war is declared both by a formal declaration and through actions that create a state of war. The Supreme Court analyzed what constitutes a war in an 1800 case called Bass v. Tingey. The issue was whether the United States was at war with France during the Quasi-War, an undeclared naval conflict between 1798 and 1800. The case involved a dispute over salvage rights for a recaptured American ship that had been seized by the French. Under federal law, the amount of salvage depended on whether the original captors were considered a public enemy, which would require the U.S. to be at war with France. The legal question was whether the United States could be at war without a formal declaration from Congress. The Supreme Court unanimously held that the U.S. was indeed at war with France, despite the absence of a formal declaration. The justices introduced a distinction between a perfect war, which is one formally declared and involving total hostilities, and an imperfect war, a conflict authorized by statute but limited in scope or method. Justice Washington explained that any contention by force between two nations in external matters under the authority of their respective governments is a public war. The war with France, while not declared, was authorized by Congress through laws permitting the use of naval force and thus constituted an imperfect but real war. When two navies are attacking each other in the Atlantic Ocean, it's fairly obvious that it's a war in the traditional sense. But what about when the president orders a drone strike in Pakistan as part of the global war on terror? Or when he orders the Air Force to use a bunker buster bomb in Iran to help an ally? Does the president need congressional approval for those limited military actions? There are two sources of authority for the use of force abroad: the Constitution and congressional authorizations for the use of military force, which are called AUMFs. However, the executive branch, under both Democratic and Republican presidents, maintains that the president has broad powers to initiate use of force without congressional approval. The president's power to direct military forces comes from Article 2, which makes the president the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy and vests in him the executive power. The Constitution also gives the president power over foreign relations. In another Supreme Court case about the Quasi-War, Chief Justice Marshall suggested that the president's high duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, as well as his power as commander-in-chief, implies some authority to deploy U.S. military force. However, in that case, the court ultimately held that the president cannot authorize military actions that exceed the limits set by Congress. In 1973, Congress imposed legal limits on the president's ability to conduct military operations without its explicit consent. The War Powers Resolution was passed in response to the Vietnam War. It states, "The constitutional powers of the President as Commander-in-Chief to introduce United States armed forces into hostilities or into situations where imminent involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated by the circumstances are exercised only pursuant to 1. A declaration of war, 2. Specific statutory authorization, or 3. A national emergency created by attack upon the United States, its territories or possessions, or its armed forces." The War Powers Resolution also requires the president to notify Congress within 48 hours whenever military actions are taken under conditions that could risk involving the United States in hostilities without prior congressional authorization. Here's how the War Powers Resolution works in a real scenario. In October 2002, Congress passed the Authorization for the Use of Military Force Against Iraq Resolution of 2002. The AUMF was passed to justify the 2003 invasion of Iraq and the removal of Saddam Hussein. It authorized President George W. Bush to defend U.S. national security against the threat allegedly posed by Iraq, which again allegedly had weapons of mass destruction. The AUMF also gave Bush authority to enforce relevant United Nations Security Council resolutions regarding those weapons. The 2002 AUMF satisfied the War Powers Resolution's requirement that military force be either declared by Congress or authorized by statute. President Bush also notified Congress within the required 48-hour window when hostilities began in March 2003. By 2011, U.S. combat operations in Iraq had largely ended and the Hussein regime was long gone. However, the 2002 AUMF did not place any limits on the duration or geographic scope of the conflict. The 2001 AUMF, authorizing the president to use military force against those responsible for 9/11, also lacked a sunset clause, meaning there was no expiration date on its use. As a result, future presidents used those AUMFs to justify airstrikes around the world. For example, in 2014, the Obama administration launched airstrikes against ISIS in Iraq and Syria, relying on both authorizations of force. The Obama administration argued that ISIS, which evolved from al-Qaeda in Iraq in some respects, qualified as an associated force under the 2001 AUMF, and that operations in Iraq could still be supported under the 2002 AUMF's broad language. Does the president have independent authority under Article 2 of the Constitution to initiate military action without Congress's approval? President Obama thought so. He asserted that his powers as commander-in-chief gave him a constitutional right to initiate those military operations without congressional approval. He was far from alone in asserting such sweeping authority. American presidents have initiated military force without congressional authorization well over 100 times, and that count was from the middle of the 20th century. Over the years, the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel, or OLC, has issued a series of opinions asserting that the president may lawfully use military force abroad when two conditions are met. First, the action serves an important national interest, and second, it does not rise to the level of war in the constitutional sense. While OLC opinions do not carry the force of law, they have played a critical role in shaping presidential war powers, particularly since there are not many court cases directly interpreting the president's authority in this area. For the first prong, whether an important national interest is at stake, OLC built its standard from earlier Justice Department opinions. It starts with a 1941 memo from Attorney General Robert Jackson, which said the Commander-in-Chief Clause gave the president the authority to order U.S. Army Air Corps members to train British pilots during World War II. Jackson, who would later become a Supreme Court justice, said training British pilots would help protect American lives and property. He also said, quote, "The President's authority has long been recognized as extending to the dispatch of armed forces outside the United States, either on missions of goodwill or rescue, or for the purpose of protecting American lives or property or American interests." Building on that idea, during the Korean War, the State Department argued that defending the integrity of the United Nations counted as a vital national interest that allowed President Truman to bypass Congress. The State Department also called it an international police action, which, read the words, it's not a war, just a conflict. So take that, Congress. Over 36,000 American casualties later, it was one heck of a non-war. In the post-Vietnam era, Congress sought to rein in presidential war powers, which led to the passage of the War Powers Resolution. But presidents didn't always agree. They pointed to that British pilot case and the Korean conflict as precedents to justify broad executive authority to act without Congress. For example, when President Clinton deployed troops to Somalia, the Office of Legal Counsel said it was necessary to protect Americans overseas and to enforce UN resolutions. Later, in 2011, when President Obama ordered airstrikes in Libya, the Justice Department identified three national interests at stake: promoting regional stability, preventing a humanitarian disaster, and deterring the use of chemical weapons. President Trump said his airstrikes on Iran were meant to stop them from getting nuclear weapons. Given how presidents have acted before, preventing a hostile country from getting nukes can be seen as a national interest. But the term national interest is pretty flexible. Critics say this test doesn't really keep the president's power in check. The second prong of the test is whether the use of force constitutes war in the constitutional sense. OLC opinions build on the rationale of Bass v. Tingey to conclude that a limited engagement is distinct from a conflict where one whole nation is at war with another whole nation. For example, in a 2018 opinion about Trump's airstrikes against Syria, OLC asserted that, quote, military operations will likely rise to the level of war only when characterized by prolonged and substantial military engagements, typically involving exposure of U.S. military personnel to significant risk over a substantial period. OLC didn't make up this interpretation of the law just for Donald Trump. As Brian Egan and Tess Bridgman pointed out in an article for Just Security, prior OLC opinions reached a similar conclusion with respect to U.S. military strikes in Libya in 2011 and U.S. military activities in Haiti in the 1990s, among others. In a 1995 opinion, OLC concluded that the president had authority under Article 2 to deploy U.S. ground troops to Bosnia to support NATO's peacekeeping efforts. Building on its earlier Somalia opinion and referencing Attorney General Jackson's 1941 memo, OLC argued that the deployment advanced important national interests, including preserving regional peace, preventing a broader conflict, and upholding NATO's credibility. In a 1994 memo about deploying U.S. forces to Haiti, OLC concluded that deployment of troops did not mean there was a real war, because, quote, the planned deployment was to take place with the full consent of the legitimate government and did not involve the risk of major or prolonged hostilities or serious casualties to either the United States or Haiti. Fast forward to 2011, when President Obama ordered airstrikes in Libya to enforce a United Nations Security Council resolution. Citing prior opinions, OLC found that the president had enough authority to act, pointing to two key national interests: preserving regional stability and supporting the credibility of the UN Security Council. Are you sensing a theme here? The Office of Legal Counsel, an executive branch office, almost always supports the president's actions. When they write these memos, they look for precedent that affirms the president's judgment that using force serves national interests. Presidents can't declare war, so anything a president does without Congress can't be a war, right? To the less cynical eye, perhaps it just means that presidents don't want to act without OLC's imprimatur. Maybe some of both. Traditionally, American presidents have relied on experts at the State Department, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and other agencies to craft foreign policy and assess the risk of military actions. But the Trump administration operates in a more, let's say, ad hoc, freewheeling manner. Here's an example.
Are you saying there that the United States did not see intelligence that the Supreme Leader had ordered weaponization?
That's irrelevant. I see that question being asked on the media. That's an irrelevant question.
No,
they have
that is
everything
the
they need
key
to build
point
a weapon.
in U.S. intelligence assessments. You know that.
No, it's not.
Yes, it was.
No, it's
that
not.
The political decision had not been made.
I know that better than you know that, and I know that that's not the case.
But I'm asking you whether the order was given.
And the people who say that, it doesn't matter if the order was given. They have everything they need to build nuclear weapons.
So what do we make of Trump's airstrikes in light of these OLC opinions? Do they fit within the idea of a limited military engagement? Well, it depends on your perspective. Trump sent a report to Congress on June 23rd in an explicit effort to be in compliance with the War Powers Resolution. In it, he echoes the magic words from OLC. The strike was taken to advance vital United States national interests. The strike was limited in scope and purpose. And I acted pursuant to my constitutional authority as Commander-in-Chief. So the Trump administration certainly thinks the Iran strikes fall within a constitutionally authorized, limited military engagement that won't lead to a prolonged war, the kind of war that requires congressional authorization. The Trump administration could point to the Libya example, saying these strikes actually help preserve regional stability. White House Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt denied the strikes risked a wider conflict, suggesting instead that the president is strengthening security in the Middle East.
And nobody knows what it means to accomplish peace through strength better than President Trump. He is the one who came up with that motto and that foreign policy doctrine, and he successfully implemented it in his first term.
Vice President Vance echoed Leavitt, stating the administration's belief that peace can be achieved through force.
Well, first of all, John, I think the president has been very clear that we are not interested in protracted conflicts in the Middle East, but there's a question about how do you achieve peace, and we believe the way that you achieve peace is through strength.
On the other hand, unlike the situation in Haiti, Iran did not invite the US or Israel to conduct military operations on its soil. Iran has a large, well-equipped military as well as numerous well-funded auxiliaries throughout the region, which raises the risk of serious casualties for all three countries involved and others. Plus, America's strikes happened in the middle of Israel's ongoing war with Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran, an already destabilized region, making it possible that hostilities could spread even further. It's important to remember that we're discussing the second prong of the test, and even under OLC's deferential interpretation of executive power, Congress must be involved if the president's actions amount to a war in the constitutional sense. Whether it crosses the threshold to traditional war or real war or war depends on the length of the engagement, level of hostilities between the countries, and the risk to military and civilian lives. That brings us back to the purpose of the airstrikes. Secretary Rubio, Vice President Vance, and Secretary Hegseth said that the goal was to damage Iran's nuclear capabilities. They said the strikes were not about regime change. President Trump immediately contradicted them, saying, quote, "It's not politically correct to use the term regime change, but if the current Iranian regime is unable to make Iran great again, why shouldn't there be a regime change? MEGA. A regime change war, which is waged to remove the government of a foreign country, is basically war in the constitutional sense. Even OLC agrees with that. In theory, it's possible that this could be the last time Israel asked the US to use its force against Hamas and Iran. Maybe Iran won't retaliate. Sorry, I'm just getting this. Yes, they've already retaliated. Iran apparently launched a few missiles towards the US base in Qatar, apparently after giving notice of their intent. No one can say for sure how things are going to develop over the next days, weeks, months. We don't know if the Trump administration will conduct sustained operations in Iran, the full extent to which Iran might retaliate, and how the rest of the world, including the United Nations Security Council, will react if the airstrikes provoke additional hostilities. Far from the situation in Bas v. Tingy, it's hard to foresee circumstances under which the US Supreme Court would rule on the legality of Trump's strikes on Iran. That leaves Congress. Will it uphold its constitutional prerogatives? Take it away, Speaker of the House and marital aid enthusiast Mike Johnson.
Many respected constitutional experts argue that the War Powers Act is itself unconstitutional. I'm persuaded by that argument. They think it's a violation of the Article 2 powers of the Commander-in-Chief. I think that's right.
Sorry, Gen Z. It's your fight now.
Thanks, Gal. Well, it looks like there's nothing to worry about because President Donald Trump has declared, seemingly unilaterally, a ceasefire, stating, "Congratulations to everyone. It has been fully agreed by and between Israel and Iran that there will be a complete and total ceasefire in approximately 6 hours from now when Israel and Iran have wound down and completed their in-progress final missions for 12 hours, at which point the war will be considered ended." That ceasefire was immediately violated.
This morning, a ceasefire agreed by the US, Iran and Israel just hours ago is shaking. Israel accusing Iran of violating the deal after saying it intercepted Iranian missiles.
Yes, congratulations, everyone. And all this despite begging the Israelis not to conduct the bombing, saying, "Israel, do not drop those bombs. If you do, it is a major violation. Bring your pilots home now." And then suggesting they do a friendly plane wave, the Israelis continued their bombings. Yes, President Trump actually said, "Israel is not going to attack Iran. All planes will turn around and head home while doing a friendly plane wave to Iran. No one will be hurt. The ceasefire is in effect." And then, of course, Iran retaliated, causing Trump to literally curse in anger.
We basically have two countries that have been fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what the fuck they're doing. Do you understand that?
Yes, it's those people that don't know what they're doing. My golly, who could have foreseen that peace in the Middle East was such a tough nut to crack? So it remains to be seen what military action will come next, especially given the reports are coming in that the bunker buster bombs were not effective and the bombing raid only set Iran back a few months. Now, it's particularly interesting to see how the media has covered the bombing and Trump's attitude towards regime change. Over 300 sources covered it, with 28% of the reporting coming from the left, 26% from the right, and 46% from the center. But when you examine the headlines, you see some very different frames emerge. Left-leaning outlets frame Trump's changing positions on Iran as products of his own musing and dreams. On the right, we see headlines that present the same statements as a bold, moral call to action. And from the center, sources typically use neutral language, which is often its own form of bias. But the headlines you read first have immense power to shape how you understand the news. And that's why I like to see the news from as many angles as I can with the help of today's sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app developed by a former NASA engineer on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news. And right now they're offering LegalEagle 40% off their unlimited access Vantage subscription. You can scan the QR code or use the link in the description to get a discount for a limited time. Because Ground News gathers related articles from around the world and across the political spectrum, so you can see the bias and compare coverage. Every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the source's reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. One of my favorite parts is their bias comparison feature, which highlights specific differences in reporting across the political spectrum. This can be especially helpful when reading stories from sources you've never heard of, or where there's no telling who owns it or what agenda they might have. I also love their blind spot feature, which shows you stories that are underreported by either side of the political spectrum, like this recent story of Border Patrol claiming that the risk of terrorist sleeper cells in the country had never been higher. And regardless of if that's even accurate or perhaps a preview of more civil liberty violations to come, you might have missed the story if you only get your news from one side. This type of analysis helps explain why we often talk past each other and why some people seem hyper-focused on what to others seems like nonsense or fake news. But all this is why Ground News is my favorite way to get the news, and as a legal eaglet, you can save 40% off the Ground News Vantage subscription by scanning the code on screen or clicking on the link down below. This subscription gives you unlimited access to every feature, including the Bias Insight tool and blind spot feed. And by subscribing, you'll support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent. So click on the link below or scan the code today. And after that, click on this link over here for more Legal Eagle, or I'll see you in court.